Chapter 21. Fiery Trials. All three animals were frozen in motionless pose. Mr. Rabbit's ears were swivelling about like a radar, and his nose was twitching too. Mr. Mousey listened hard, but all had gone silent, and he couldn't be sure that he was hearing anything apart from the heavy breathing of Nogger behind him. "It's coming this way, whatever it is," whispered the rabbit. "And it's big." "Quick, off the road," whispered Mr. Mousey, and as if they had rehearsed it many times before, all three immediately rolled off the path and ended up on their stomachs in the grass and bushes to the side of the track. Mr. Mousey still couldn't hear anything, but judging by the amazing jiggling of his pal's ears, Mr. Rabbit certainly did. And judging by the expression on his face, he didn't like what he heard. Now the mouse could hear the noise again himself. It was a heavy scraping and tearing, as if something was dragging itself up the road from the direction they had been heading, and not dragging itself any too carefully either. Nogger had a determined "I'm a fearless pirate" look on his face, and was clutching his cutlass in his right hand. Somehow the extra person made Mr. Mousey feel a little bit better, and he was glad that Nogger was with them, even if it had not been through the best of circumstances. Mr. Mousey took a quick look around. In front was the path and the approaching whatever, and behind lay the dark thickness of the forest unexplored. Before he had a chance to work out some sort of a plan of what to do, the object of their fears turned the corner and came into view. Big wasn't the right word at all. The thing heaving its way towards them was monstrously enormous. In fact, it was monstrous, because it was indeed a monster. To be more exact, a dragon. Not a noise was uttered by the three hiding in the undergrowth, but if eyes could talk, then 6 eyeballs were screaming at the top of their big round voices. They lay transfixed as the creature approached. It was easily as big as an elephant and twice the length. Green in colour, its armoured, scaly skin rippled with muscle as it pounded the earth, with rear legs like tree stumps, its forelegs more like muscled arms. All 4 limbs were clawed, and a long swaying tail tapered out behind, finishing in an arrow of hard bone-like horn. From this tip, a ragged row of spines travelled along the top of its back to finish at the gruesome head, gruesome and ugly. On the end of a long and powerful neck, this head darted about, looking into the trees to the right and to the left, as if looking for something. Great yellow eyes, widely spaced on its vile head, were alive and full of evil intelligence. From there, the head tapered down to an extended nose, and at the end, 2 large blackened nostrils sat like 2 fuming pits. Along each side of the snout, from nostrils to eyes, ran knobbly lines of raised bumps. Folded in close to its body were 2 black, leathery wings. What size they must open out to was anyone's guess, thought Mr. Mousey, as his wits fought to return. Unfortunately, Mr. Rabbit and Nogger's wits were very much out for the day. Instead, a whole family of frightful fears had come to inhabit their minds, and were running about each of their heads, making quite a fuss. Mr. Rabbit, for example, who had hoped never to get any closer to an actual dragon than a good-sized continent, was trying to prevent himself from leaping up and running for all he was worth. It was not hard, mind you, to prevent himself because every muscle in his body felt like a jellyfish in a food mixer. He wished he could get his eyes off the hideous sight before him, but was prevented by the fear that if he even moved his eyelids, the great yellow eyes would detect him. He wondered briefly if the whole thing was a horrible nightmare, but was unconvinced. Nightmares just didn't come this scary. Nogger was convinced he was at the end of a life that had been pretty interesting up to this point. He hadn't really expected to survive the forest in any case, but it would have been nicer to have if he had felt he had finished off in a more gracious manner. Flame grilled and eaten by a vile monster would not have been the end he would have chosen. Even though he could not see the smoking reptile too clearly, it was a lot clearer than he would have liked. Strangely too, he felt saddened that he wouldn't get to know his two companions better. They had been kinder to him already than most, and seemed to accept him just as he was, a not too bright pirate, short-sighted and all. Suddenly, as the creature came to the point in the trail beside which the three lay hiding, it stopped, jerking its head and sniffing the air. Dragons actually do not have a very good sense of smell. Since a good bit of their time is spent breathing fire and generally having evil-smelling smoke curling out of their nostrils, there is a pretty good reason for this. What they do have, however, is a finely tuned sense of fear. Not their own, of course. When you're a 30-foot-long specimen of armoured spine and muscle, capable of making enough fire come out of your nose to run a medium-sized power station, and teeth like swords, spears, arrows, or whatever else pointy, dangerous thing you can imagine, then you generally don't find yourself too bothered by much else. Male dragons are maybe a little put out by female dragons, but that's another story. And anyway, not confined to dragons. What it was sniffing at was the sudden and unmistakable sense of fear that was flooding the air. Something was afraid. Something small. Something very close. And probably edible, as most things are to a dragon. Slowly its great head swiveled towards the three, sniffing all the time, getting closer, closer. A sudden movement beside Mr. Rabbit made him jump, and before his mind could take it in, his eyes beheld a sight more unbelievable than he could have imagined. The little mouse, his heart beating wildly, had had a few moments to think as the creature paused beside them. In those few moments he had formulated a plan, not a big one, or in the least complex, but a plan nonetheless. He was now putting it into action. Basically, the plan was this: attack the dragon. So it was that Nogger and the rabbit gazed open-mouthed as Mr. Mousey leapt to his feet, drawing his cutlass, and darted straight at the dragon, a cry on his lips. Well, there is a principle that states that attack is the best form of defence, so to be fair to the mouse, his plan was perhaps not just as crazy as it appeared to his colleagues in the grass. "For all that is good and true," called Mr. Mousey, swinging his blade above his head. Straight for the dragon he rushed, a dwarf against a mighty creature of legend, a fly attacking a tiger. Now, dragons aren't used to this kind of behaviour, and the whole experience was a little unsettling for this particular one. 1 minute, there he was, drinking in the scent of fear and future supper, and within seconds he was being attacked by what seemed to be, of all things, a mouse. Now, Had Mr. Mousey just run out brandishing his cutlass and striking a threatening pose, without doubt the dragon would have quickly regained its composure and without further ado have torched and eaten our hapless hero before you'd have had time to say cheese toasties. As it was, the little mouse did not slow in his courageous charge, but carried right on up to the green giant, and with a mighty effort began piling on blows to the scaly skin before him with his pirate blade. "Back, you great brute!" he cried. "Back to your evil lair before I lay you out for the birds to eat." For the first time in its life, the dragon retreated. Just a few steps, enough to try and take what was happening here, but no such luck. The tiny screaming creature was following and swiping with a rather uncomfortable stinging knife. "You won't run from me, you great coward! Come on, face me if you dare and see how long you last." Mr. Mousey had actually got himself quite angry now, and although most of this was pure bluff, a fair slice was the true heart of the mouse. For only the second time in its life, this dragon stepped back again. Half the problem was that the blinking thing having a go at him was so close, it was hard to get a decent look at it to react properly. At this moment, Mr. Mousey called back to his friends, "Now, Mr. Rabbit, now, Nogger, run for your lives, run to the forest, don't look back." As if shaken out of a dream, Nogger and the rabbit did just that. Turning to the green unknown, they ran as fast as they knew, far away, onto the trail and into the pathless maze of trees. Mr. Mousey turned back on the dragon as he saw his friends take off the trail and run into the woods, and with a quick spurt of speed ran straight at it, passing under its belly and stabbing upwards as he did so. The dragon flinched at the sharp stab of pain and immediately went from confused to angry. Continuing his run, the mouse carried on over the path to the other side and dived into the undergrowth off the trail. Now boiling with rage, the dragon, seeing his attacker disappear under its belly and feeling the pain, immediately threw itself crashing onto the ground, grinding its stomach onto the earth, and also, it thought, the bones of the mouse. As the hideous creature writhed on the ground, crushing to a pulp the imagined mouse, the actual mouse saw its chance and bolted back across the trail behind the view of the dragon and escaping in the direction of the retreating rabbit and beaver deep into the forest. It very nearly worked. As Mr. Mousey beat his retreat across the path and into the trees beyond, a shaft of light pouring through the forest canopy caught the shining blade of the cutlass and reflected in a bright sparkle of light. It was only a brief flash, but it was enough to catch the corner of the eye of the dragon and cause him to swing his head to the root of the speeding mouse. Victims in flight are very much bread and butter to a dragon's modus operandi, and immediately all his systems went from angry confusion to clear-cut strategy. Chase and kill. Every ounce of energy within the body of the mouse was at that minute being spent on running, specifically in leg power, willing his legs to move faster, striving to push as much of the planet behind him as was mousely possible. A dart of brown, he leapt over tree roots, flew over boulders and tussocks of grass, and caught brief snatches through the trees of his friends doing the same thing a good bit in front. Ivy strands brushed by his face, cobweb sheets burst before him, and his mind was intensely alert and supremely aware of his surroundings as he fled. It was almost as if everything was unfolding in slow motion. He ducked as head-height branches appeared before him, twisted his body as vast trunks threatened to impede his way, and took off like a gazelle across rivulets and ditches. Dragons are not so easily outrun, however. back on the trail, the green killing machine now unfurled its black leather wings and in a single mighty sweep powered itself vertically upwards to above the height of the trees. Neck and tail outstretched, it moved great swathes of air behind it in slow, violent beats and aimed for a point in the forest ahead. A point presently occupied by a quickly moving mouse. With another almighty backward sweep, the dragon began a steep dive into the trees, wood smashing and splintering as the solid form smashed trees into so much firewood as it crashed straight through. Mouth open, it inhaled deeply and erupted in 2 jets of scorching fire from its nostrils. Behind him, Mr. Mousey had heard the tearing and smashing, but still hadn't looked back. A tremendous roar now filled his ears, and he fired a quick look over his shoulder just in time to see the advancing twin sheets of fire. Even then he barely had time to throw himself into a ditch before him as the blast of heat caught up and passed over, missing by inches, or almost missing. Mr. Mousey still carried his backpack on his back, and tied to the top was the magic carpet. The carpet took some of the fiery blast, and as he lay down in the ditch he could smell the scorched material. Just with that, there was another sensation as the dragon swept by, climbing for another attack, great yellow eyes flashing straight at the prone shape of Mr. Mousey. Meanwhile, in their terrifying flight through the forest, Nogger and Mr. Rabbit could see none of this, but heard the distant crashing and roaring as the dragon wreaked destruction before it. They had now come to a valley in the forest and found themselves careering down a steep hillside in the trees. At the bottom, a river blocked their way, so they veered right and ran puffing along its western bank. After a bit, the river curled to the left, and suddenly, before them, appeared a small stone house. Nogger would never have seen it, since it was partly hidden under a cliffy overhang. Evidently the river had at one time flowed out this far and had cut into the bank, leaving a scooped out area under the rising ground. The roof of the house was made of thick, flat stones, and as they approached, 2 windows and a stout wooden door became visible. Without pausing to see if it was inhabited, the 2 creatures burst in through the unlocked door and arrived in a dusty but furnished room. Nogger threw himself gasping onto the wooden floor, but Mr. Rabbit turned and spoke in between his own gasps. I'll be back. He stood gulping for air at the doorway, his own cutlass now in hand. I'm going back for my friend. Nogger was too exhausted to argue. Mr. Mousey, meanwhile, had seen his opportunity, and as the dragon wheeled, he gathered himself to his feet and once again spurted off, straight ahead, as fast as he could go. The dragon had climbed up above the trees, and turning began his second steep dive into the forest. Once again, trees splintered and gave way before the angry form of the fiery horror as it projected 2 more bolts of tumbling fire at the little brown running shape. This time Mr. Mousey was at least forewarned, and he dived behind a boulder that came up to his left. Huddled in behind the mossy stone, he cringed as the fiery blasts blasted by each side of the boulder. The breath sucked from his very mouth as the flames devoured air, grass, and anything else it could consume. As the little mouse once again leapt up and hurtled himself down the forest floor, the dreadful carnage caused by the dragon's attacks were visible all around, like a scene from a war film. Blackened earth and smoking stumps of shattered trees littered the ground. Above, the sky was clearly visible, where his attacker had created open swathes of space in the forest canopy. And in that gap, he caught sight of the monster spinning in the air for the 3rd dive. Mr. Mousey was tired. His legs were aching and his lungs felt tight and sore. He doubted if he could keep on evading the attacks of the dragon for much longer, and he felt as if it was only playing with him in any case, as a cat might with a mouse, and he didn't like that example either. Indeed, the dragon was rather enjoying the demonstration of awesome firepower that it was giving Mr. Mousey. Dragons much prefer their meals roasted and terrified, and so, to make sure that this strange, apparently unterrified mouse was sufficiently frightened out of its wits, he was giving it the full fiery trial. It had more or less decided that 3 good flaming passes would do the job, so this time it climbed a good bit higher before turning and descending in a screaming dive at the mouse. Mr. Mousey now found himself running down a steep hill in the forest, and only just managed to keep his feet as he jumped over the mass of vines and twigs below his feet. Coming behind him, the dragon felt playtime was over, and it closed one yellow eye as it took careful aim on the creature below. I don't know if Mr. Rabbit's mother ever told him, but lots of other mothers have warned their children, as perhaps has your own, of the dangers of everyday hazards. How many small children have had their mothers warn them not to touch hot kettles, or to keep away from the steep edges of rivers, or to never, ever run with scissors or sharp implements? At that precise moment, the precise moment that Mr. Mousey was hurtling down the steep hill, Mr. Rabbit was running up it. He was carrying a very sharp implement indeed. A good bit ahead of him, he saw the outline of his running friend, and joy filled his soul. A second later, he saw the diving dragon, and twice as quickly it all drained out. This is where Mr. Rabbit did what was probably the bravest thing in all his life. He kept running towards the events unfolding before him. The ground was difficult to cross, roots and vines covered the forest floor, and it was one of those roots that played a part in what happened next. Ahead, the dragon was inhaling and holding its aim for the final frazzle. The gap was closing to just about the perfect distance as far as it was concerned. Below, Mr. Mousey had just caught sight of the rabbity outlines of what could only be his friend, bounding over the ground and swirling a cutlass over his head. "Down!" he cried, trying to warn Mr. Rabbit of what he knew was coming. Get down, Mr. Rabbit!" He never got the sentence finished, as Mr. Rabbit immediately went down. Before he had time to wonder at the prompt observance of his call, something shiny went spinning overhead, on and behind him. Mr. Rabbit, of course, hadn't heard the cry at all. In his haste, and looking up at the dragon rather than at his way ahead, he had tripped on a tree root and went from very fast forward to very flat horizontal. Unfortunately for him, he did not fall on the very sharp implement, fortunately for him, he did not fall on the very sharp implement he was carrying, and it flew from his grasp ahead and up at great speed, just as effectively as if he had thrown it with all his might. Fortunately for Mr. Mousey, it missed him by a good 10 feet and spun by on overhead. Unfortunately for the dragon, it did not miss in the slightest. Just as he was in the motion of releasing another twin blast of fire, the spinning cutlass found somewhere to stop. The middle of the single open great yellow eye. In a fearful howl of pain, the dragon veered to the left and attempted to climb up and away from its unknown attacker. The pain it was experiencing was a wholly new sensation to the hateful beast, and this, coupled with the fact that it had now both of its eyes firmly closed, caused it to misjudge its position in the air. Spinning instead of climbing, it came crashing down into the forest far to the left of the mouse, who was now concentrating on avoiding the following fire. Mr. Mousey took the third dive of the last 3 minutes and found himself 6 feet from and facing the white face of his rabbit friend. Before either had time to say a word, the partly expelled fiery breath of the dragon, now tearing up great tracts of soft, earthy forest floor, passed over at head height. Had the dragon had time to fire full blast, that would probably have been the end of both Mouse and the rabbit, and as it was a jolly unpleasant 2 seconds as the heat burned their ears and made their eyes water in pain. As soon as it passed, Mr. Mousey wasted no time. He leapt up and grabbed Mr. Rabbit by the arm. "Come on, let's get out of here," he cried, "before the beast recovers himself." The dazed rabbit began to follow Mr. Mousey through the charred surroundings until they came to the river, and he turned left. Suddenly he seemed to come awake. "No, Mr. Mousey," he called, "not that way. Follow me." He turned right and followed the western bank of the river until at last they came to the turn in the river and the little stone house hidden below the craggy overhang. Following in obedient bewilderment, Mr. Mousey followed his friend in through the door and came face to face with another friendly face. Whew, that was close, wasn't it, boys and girls? I'm telling you, the dragon nearly got them there. Thank goodness for Mr. Rabbit, eh? Anyway, that's the end of that chapter, so we'll have to see what happens next in the little house when they meet Nogger. So thanks for listening again, and God bless, and you take care. Bye bye.